Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So, let's say you seem very excited about your exam next week, so I'm glad to see that. But today, we want to add one more arrow to your quiver of analytical abilities, mostly because this will also be on the exam. So, as I mentioned at the end on Tuesday, one of the things we haven't really talked about up to this point is money and inflation. And if you think about it, way back on day one and then again on day two, I mentioned that macroeconomics is really about trying to understand and explain three big macroeconomic events, or movements in macroeconomic variables. We're interested in what happens to real GDP, both in the short run as well as the long run. Well, we spent a lot of time already talking about what happens to real GDP in the long run. We're also interested in either the unemployment rate or the amount of employment, and we've talked a little bit about that with our production function labor market diagram and model. And then the third big thing that macroeconomics pays a lot of attention to is inflation. And we've gone for the last 3 weeks without mentioning inflation a single time. Right? We didn't mention it with the production function analysis. We didn't mention it with saving and investment analysis. And we didn't mention it in the context of the solo growth model. But we know that inflation is out there, and there are reasons to worry about it, either being too high or too low. We also know that in all of our discussions about these various models, we've never talked about money or how transactions actually get financed. So we probably need to bring both of these items back in. Our discussion today about money and inflation will be about money and inflation over the long run, just like our solo model. So we want to think about longer time periods, not what's happening to the money supply this month or last month or even the last year, not what's happened to inflation over the last year, but think about it over, say, an average annual change over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right? What are those long-run changes? So that's where we're going to be talking about today, where we're going to be going. At the end, because I'm going to skip the part on the Federal Reserve, which we'll come back to later, I'll talk a little bit about item number 6. What does that say? Oh, okay, exam number 1. Okay, so if we're going to talk about money, we actually need to know what it is that we're talking about, right? We have to have some sort of definition. Now, we all have this general idea about what money is. The only problem with our general ideas about what money is that's not the way economists think about it. So, from an economics perspective, we think about money in a very, very specific way. Money is simply a financial asset that serves 3 functions simultaneously. It serves as a unit of account, as a store of value, and as a medium of exchange. What does all that mean? The unit of account is simply how we price things. Right? So notice that in the United States, we price things in US dollar terms. In Europe, they price things in euros, or British pounds, or Swiss francs, or whatever other currency that particular country might be using. Right? So what we call money, the name we give to it, is also how we price things, unit of account. Okay? The second function is as a store of value. So those financial assets that we use as money can be spent right now. They're very, very liquid in that transactional process, but we don't have to spend it today. Now, I know money often burns a hole in our pocket, and we need to spend it today, but it is possible to actually put it in an envelope, give it to your professor to hold on to for you, put it in a drawer, put it under your mattress, and save it, right, and be able to use it at some time in the future. So it will still have some purchasing power in the future. That's a store of value. There are lots of assets, financial assets, that serve as stores of value, right? Stocks and bonds, houses, lots of things can serve as a store of value. What makes money unique amongst those assets that can serve as a store of value is that it also serves that third function as the medium of exchange. So when we go to make a transaction, we actually have 2 choices on how to pay for the transaction. Right? A, we can use this financial asset that we can call money. When we use that financial asset we call money, the transaction is then finalized. You get the goods and services, you've paid your money away. You've paid maybe against your debts if you have debts or loans. Right? There's a second way, however, in which we can facilitate transactions, and that is we can use our credit card, or maybe mom and dad's credit card. That would be great. So we use a credit card. But notice, even though the transaction has taken place, it is not finalized. How do we know it's not finalized? Because a week or 2 or 3 later, what happens? Bing, you've got mail, right? Either snail mail or electronic mail from your credit card company. And what do they want you to do? Send them real money, right? Credit is only a loan. It's not money. There's a distinction between the two. Right? So what we also need to do, though, is think about what financial assets filter into those 3 categories. Our unit of account, our store of value, and our medium of exchange. Right? In the United States, we actually have 2 groups of assets that we think of as money, which in our very creative way, we call M1, the first definition of money, and M2, the second definition of money. What do you think we would call it if we had a third definition of money? That would be hard to figure out, wouldn't it? Okay, so the assets that are in M1. Now, M1 is sometimes referred to as narrow money or the medium of exchange money, because these are the assets that we primarily use to facilitate transactions that are finalized. So the first is currency, which means paper money and coins. Right? So we all know in this country that's little pieces of green paper with pictures of dead people on it. Traveler's checks don't matter anymore because they're so tiny. The second asset, though, that we can make transactions with, and the transaction then gets finalized, is by writing a check. Right? Most of us have checking accounts. You can go to the store, write a check, they accept it, transaction's done. Your check is officially called a demand deposit. Right? When you sign those papers to open up your checking account, and all that tiny print, which I'm sure you read, not. So all that paperwork said, the bank promises to pay you any funds out that are in your account when you demand them. That's why we call them demand accounts. Right? The bank is agreeing that they will pay you any funds that you demand to be paid. That's all a check is, right? Pay to the order of somebody else. You sign it. You're demanding that another party be paid the amount that you've written on there. As long as the funds are in your account, you're good to go. Okay, so that's demand deposits. Notice we hold more paper money than we have in our checking accounts. How many of you have more paper money in your wallet than you have in your checking account? I don't have very much in either, so that's easy. Okay. Then there's this other category called other checkable deposits. These are similar to demand deposits, checking accounts, but they have certain restrictions on them. How many checks you can write per month, the minimum size, the maximum size, various and sundry things like that. But in essence, they're just another type of demand deposit. Total it all up, you can see we have $2.5 trillion in M1 accounts. Okay? Again, this is called narrow money or the medium of exchange money. This is the stuff we actually spend. Now, this is a graph of what M1 has done. Now, the thing to notice about this graph is that, goodness, it looks an awful lot like the increase in real GDP. Right? Remember, our long-term chart of real GDP has a shape that's something like that. And that should make sense to you. Remember, real GDP is also expenditures. If expenditures are growing, chances are we need more money, more medium of exchange to facilitate all of those transactions. So it's not surprising at all that this chart looks very similar to our GDP chart. Also notice, however, that since the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, M1 has gone way up, growing much, much more rapidly than it had before that, even though the economy hasn't been. Now, our second definition of money, called M2, sometimes referred to as the broad money supply, right? And this includes everything that was in M1, plus it includes things like savings deposits or small time deposits or something known as retail money market mutual funds. These are all different kinds of banking type accounts with some sort of restriction on them about how often you can take money out of them. So on a time deposit, small time deposit, it might be when you entered into the agreement with the bank, you said, I will leave my money here for 6 months or 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or 10 years. And because you're willing to leave it on deposit for a longer period of time, the bank is generally willing to pay you a higher interest rate. Saving deposits, yes, you can take your money out, but if you didn't read the fine print, you wouldn't know that the bank can actually require 7 days written notice before you take your money out. So notice that there's some restrictions then on taking money or funds out of these types of accounts. Also notice, however, none of these are really the medium of exchange. You can't go anywhere and hand somebody your account balance in your savings account and make a payment with it, or your small deposit, the time deposit, or your money market mutual fund. So they're not really part of the medium of exchange, which raises the interesting question, why would we count them as money? And the reason for that is that banking technology has improved sufficiently that it's really easy to move funds out of these types of accounts into your M1 accounts. So just as an example, I have probably only $100, $200 in my checking account. I just don't write very many checks. There's no particular reason for me to have a lot of money there. I put a lot of things on my credit card, and that nasty credit card company still sends me this piece of paper once a month that says, oh, by the way, send us this big amount of money. And I look at my checking account balance and say, ooh, I don't have that much there. So what do? I simply transfer money out of my savings account to my checking account so the check will clear when the credit card company cashes it. Right? That's so easy to do. In fact, it's even easier than that because my bank will let me take money out of my savings account to pay it electronically. So while none of these are really the medium of exchange, the technology in the banking system has gotten so good that this stuff can be translated into the medium of exchange almost instantaneously. So this is why we sometimes refer to this as near money. Near money, meaning it's almost the medium of exchange. This is also the monetary aggregate that the Federal Reserve watches most closely. For that matter, it's the monetary aggregate, the second definition, is the monetary aggregate that most central banks around the world pay attention to, rather than the more narrow definition of M1. Once again, you can see that the M2 numbers have risen over time, very much like the M1 numbers, very much like the real GDP numbers. And this is their growth rates. So this is a year-on-year growth rate of M1 in the blue and M2 in the orange. The thing to notice about this is that they broadly tracked one another up until about 1990. And then all of a sudden they started going in very different directions. This was due to two things that happened. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the U.S. government deregulated financial systems. Took a lot of the regulations off what financial firms could do, so they started doing lots of different things. This just happened to coincide with the early technology drives by banks and other financial institutions. It took about 10 years for the technology to all of a sudden catch up with what they were able to do, but notice that starting in 1990-ish, now some of these things are way off from one another. Like many other graphs that we've looked at that compare to series, something happened in the 1980s to really make a difference, post-80s from pre-80s. This is no different than that. Now, we know what money is. We also have to talk about what money is not. Again, in our common parlance, we often use the word money incorrectly from an economic perspective. So we might say something like, Bill Gates is worth $50-some-odd billion. He has a lot of money. The fact of the matter is, I have no idea how much money Bill Gates has, right? Because all we'd be looking at is M1 and M2 accounts that are in Bill Gates' name. My guess is he probably doesn't have that much. He's probably got a lot of Microsoft stock, probably a lot of stock and a bunch of other stuff as well, in real estate and other. He's very wealthy, but he probably doesn't have all that much money. So we want to make sure when we use the word money, in this class at least, we mean the medium of exchange, not wealth. Likewise, most of you are going to graduate in the next couple of years. You're going to get really good, high-paying jobs, and your friends are going to say, you're terrific. You're now making a lot of money. Again, an incorrect usage of that word. You might be making a lot of income, but money is a financial asset. It's a particular set of financial assets. So we want to make sure that when we use the word money, at least in class, that we mean the medium of exchange. We use wealth to talk about how rich somebody is or not, and we use income to talk about their income flows. Now the question is, where does all the money come from? Basically two sources, and we'll see this in more detail in a couple of weeks. Currency and coins, the paper money and the metal money that we use, are issued directly by the government. If you pulled out a piece of green paper with a dead president on it, it might look something like this. By the way, not all of them are presidents, but they're all dead. Look at that. Right across the top it says Federal Reserve Note. Right? So this is actually issued by the Federal Reserve after it was printed by the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, which is part of the Department of Treasury, which is obviously the U.S. government. So green pieces of paper issued by the government, coins issued by the government. There are lots of other assets, though, that we saw, right? Demand deposits, other checkable deposits, savings accounts. All of that type of money is actually issued by financial institutions. banks, savings and loans, mortgage finance companies, all sorts of different kinds of firms. Right? So notice then that the government issues some of the money, but the financial system, part of the private sector, actually issues a bunch of it as well. And indeed, if you look at those numbers, you would see that what the government issues, $1.2 trillion in currency and coin, versus M1 of 2.5 and M2 of whatever the number was, I don't remember, 10-something, that the government actually issues the minority amount of the money in circulation. We'll also see, again in more detail in a couple of weeks, that there are three economic agents that are really important in determining how much money is actually in circulation in the economy. The central bank, Federal Reserve in the case of the United States, depository institutions, that is banks, institutions that take deposits and, importantly, also make loans. And then also individuals, households, and businesses. Right? So their interactions will determine what the supply of money is in the economy. Now, the way the central bank operates in all of this is it can create money whenever it buys assets from the public. So remember here, when we talk about the public, we're talking about the non-governmental sector of the economy. So when the central bank buys assets from the public, it needs to pay for them. One of the unique things about central banks is they can literally create money out of thin air. They simply make an electronic deposit in the seller's bank account. Okay? We'll see how that works a little bit later. So this is how money gets into circulation. The money, though, only works in circulation if everybody is willing to accept it in exchange for goods and services. Remember, some of those services are working, right? So I like it when the bank pays, or when the university pays me. But if I didn't trust the money they were paying me with, we might have to have a little discussion about that. In order to make the money more acceptable in exchange, the government often declares that money, whatever that currency is, that the currency, paper money and coins, is what we refer to as legal tender. What legal tender means is that the government will accept that paper money in payment of your taxes. If the government is willing to accept it, then broadly speaking, so will everybody else. Now, in the United States, the government's gone a little bit further. If you take out a dollar of any denomination, and you look in the lower left-hand corner in the tiny print, it will say, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Not only can you pay your taxes or any debts you owe the government with paper U.S. money, you can pay anybody in the United States under a debt contract that's denominated in U.S. dollars with those pieces of paper. So notice, though, that in order to keep that acceptable, that is, that we're willing to take these pieces of paper, they must retain their value. They must retain their value. That's where inflation comes in. Okay, I'm going to skip through much of this. We'll come back to all of this. Slide 31. So the previous slide that we had up there talked about the way in which a central bank affects the money supply is by buying assets from the public. In the United States and in most developed countries, all central banks do this through something known as open market operations. An open market operation simply means that the central bank is buying or selling something with complete transparency. Nothing's being hidden. Not the dollar amount, not what's being purchased, the specific assets, nor the price that they're being purchased at. So everything is out in the open. The entire financial markets know exactly what the central bank is doing. There are also closed market operations that are basically hidden from the public. And because they're hidden, they're generally done for nefarious reasons. That the central bank or the government wants to do something that the public does not know about. Closed market operations are illegal in the United States, as they are in most other countries. Okay? So it's just a buying and selling. In the United States, most of the buying and selling involves U.S. government securities or the securities of U.S. government-sponsored agencies, something that's really only come about since the financial crisis. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So let's think about how this works. When the bank, central bank, the Federal Reserve buys government securities, it has to pay for them. So it makes an electronic credit in the seller's bank account. Notice that the seller now has a higher bank balance. The demand deposit balance has just gone up. There's more money there. But it's more than just that, because the bank can now lend out some of that increased money that's sitting around in the bank to other people. When the bank lends out money, the way it lends it to you is that it puts funds into your checking account. So the money supply increases again. So that's how the central bank can increase the money supply. They can also turn around and do just the opposite. Rather than buying government securities, the central bank could sell government securities out of their portfolio that they've acquired over time by buying them. If they sell them, the private sector buyer has to pay for them. The money comes out of the buyer's checking account or demand deposit. Now the bank has less money available for making loans. It reduces its loans and reduces the money supply. Again, we'll look at this in much more detail in a couple of weeks. But by doing open market buys and sells or purchases and sales, the central bank can control the money supply. In fact, it can control it reasonably well over the intermediate to long term. So if you want to know why the money supply has done what it's done over the past 10 years, on average, it's all up to the Federal Reserve or whatever central bank we're looking at. With that in mind, we now want to think about how money is related to inflation. And this relationship is derived under something known as the quantity theory of money.